May 15th, 1911. A decision lands in Washington, and one of the richest men in America is not in the courtroom when the verdict becomes real. The company he built is about to be cut into pieces. The strange part? The pieces may be worth more than the whole. For decades, John D. Rockefeller had done something more powerful than sell oil. He had learned where the oil business could be squeezed. Not at the well, the lamp, or even the barrel. At the choke points, the refineries first, then the railroad rates, the pipelines, the storage tanks, and the legal structures no customer ever saw. And by 1911, the United States government was effectively saying, you did not just build a company. You built a private control system around a national necessity. That is the tension at the center of Rockefeller's story. Not genius versus villain. Not efficiency versus corruption. Something colder. Control over bottlenecks compounds faster than product excellence, until the bottleneck itself becomes the indictment. Before Standard Oil became a trust, before the hearings, before the breakup, the oil business was chaos. In the 1860s, petroleum was not yet the calm, industrial machine it would become. It was fever, a rush of wells in Pennsylvania, refiners appearing wherever capital and courage could be found, prices rising, collapsing, rising again, barrels leaking, kerosene quality varying wildly. Fires were common. Waste was everywhere. Crude oil was not just a commodity. It was a scheduling problem, a safety problem, a quality problem, and a transportation problem all at once. Rockefeller looked at that market and did not start where the public imagination usually starts. He did not try to own the oil fields first. He focused on refining. That sounds less romantic, but it was more controllable. A refinery could be measured. Costs could be reduced. Waste products could be repurposed. Quality could be standardized. Shipping could be negotiated. Scale could turn small margins into enormous advantage. Rockefeller had a bookkeeper's mind in an industry full of gamblers. He cared about inputs, yields, barrel costs, freight charges, credit terms, and the difference between a profitable shipment and a shipment that only looked profitable because nobody had counted the waste. That discipline mattered, because in a market this chaotic, the winner was not always the person who found more oil. Sometimes it was the person who lost less money handling it. On January 10th, 1870, Rockefeller and his partners incorporated Standard Oil in Ohio with $1 million in capital. That was a serious amount of money for the time. It was also a signal. This was no longer a local refining partnership. It was a capitalized vehicle built for consolidation. The first financial move was simple. Start with the bottleneck you can actually control. In a fragmented industry, Rockefeller did not need to own every well or persuade every customer one by one. If he could refine more cheaply, more reliably, and at greater volume than competitors, he could turn volatility into an advantage. Standard Oil did have real strengths. It produced consistent kerosene. It reduced costs. It used byproducts others wasted. It negotiated hard because it shipped in huge volume. It invested in systems when many rivals were still operating like speculators. That matters, because the lesson is not that Rockefeller won only through dirty tactics. The sharper lesson is that efficiency made the control strategy credible. Without real operating advantages, coercive leverage collapses quickly. With real advantages, it can look like inevitability. Now imagine you are a small Cleveland refiner in 1870. You are not stupid. You know the market is overbuilt. You know too many refineries are chasing unstable supply. You know rail freight can decide whether you survive. You also know your bank does not have infinite patience. If kerosene prices fall, if crude costs spike, if your shipments get worse terms than the refinery across town, your independence may last only as long as your credit line. Then Standard Oil appears with capital, scale, and a willingness to buy. Rockefeller's offer does not arrive in a vacuum. It arrives inside fear. If you sell, you may preserve some wealth. If you refuse, you face a competitor that can live on margins you cannot. What do? That question would become more brutal 2 years later. In early 1872, a company called the South Improvement Company became the center of one of the most damaging episodes in Rockefeller's career. The arrangement involved railroads and a group of refiners. Its most explosive feature was not merely discounted shipping. Large shippers often received discounts. The scandal was discrimination and secrecy. Rebates for insiders, higher rates for outsiders, and drawbacks that could allow favored refiners to benefit from competitors' shipments. In plain English, an outsider could pay to ship oil, and an insider could still profit from that outsider's shipment. That was the threat, not just lower costs. A system where the gatekeeper and the favored competitor were economically linked. When word spread, Independent oil producers and refiners saw the danger immediately. This was not ordinary competition. This looked like a private toll gate placed across the entire oil trade. The reaction was fierce. Producers organized, newspapers attacked, rivals panicked. The oil regions treated the arrangement not as a business contract, but as an emergency. To producers, it threatened the price they could receive for crude. To refiners outside the circle, it threatened the cost of reaching market. To railroads, it promised order after rate wars, but at the cost of public rage. And to Rockefeller, it revealed something he would never forget. The movement of oil was more valuable than the oil itself. The South Improvement Company arrangement collapsed under public pressure before it could operate as planned in the way its enemies feared. But the damage had already begun. For Rockefeller, the panic created opportunity. In February and March of 1872, during what became known as the Cleveland Massacre, Standard Oil bought or absorbed a large share of Cleveland's refining capacity. Some owners sold because they believed resistance was hopeless. Some feared railroad discrimination. Some saw Standard as the only buyer with enough capital to end the uncertainty. Others hated the terms but hated the uncertainty more. That distinction matters. A forced sale does not always look like a man with a weapon at the door. Sometimes it looks like a spreadsheet where every future path has been narrowed except one. By the end of the episode, Rockefeller had strengthened his Cleveland base enormously. But he had also lost something that would never fully return: credibility. This is one of the key turns in the story. Standard Oil converted crisis into consolidation. Financially, it worked. Reputationally, it planted the seed of antitrust. Rockefeller and his defenders could point to lower costs, improved quality, and industry discipline. Critics could point to secretive leverage, fear, and the pressure placed on outsiders. Both could be true. That is what makes this story useful. A business can be efficient and still become politically dangerous. Founder can reduce waste and still build a structure that others experience as coercion. Rockefeller's mistake was not misunderstanding power. He understood power better than almost anyone around him. The mistake was assuming that private control over public bottlenecks could remain just a business question. The railroads were not a side issue. They were the circulatory system of oil. Oil had to move from wells to refineries, from refineries to markets, from Cleveland and Pittsburgh to ports and cities. If freight rates determined survival, then freight rates were strategy, not logistics. Strategy. And after 1872, Rockefeller's world changed. He had not merely won assets. He had gained a reputation that would follow every later move. Each acquisition looked less like discipline and more like conquest. Each contract looked less like efficiency and more like a trap. This is the competitor gap in most Rockefeller stories. They focus on monopoly as an outcome. But monopoly was not the strategy. Control was the strategy. Monopoly was what control looked like after enough bottlenecks had been captured. For a while, railroads gave Standard leverage. Then, in 1879, the next challenge appeared: Tidewater. The Tidewater Pipeline Company threatened to bypass the railroads by moving oil through pipeline infrastructure toward the East Coast. For Standard, this was not a minor operational threat. It attacked the bottleneck. If oil could move without railroads, then railroad rebates and freight leverage became less decisive. The old choke point was weakening. This is the transition that matters. In 1872, the fight was over railroad access. By 1879, the fight was over whether railroads had to matter at all. Tidewater was not just a pipeline company. It was a route around Rockefeller's map. It gave producers and independent refiners the possibility of imagining a market where Standard's strongest transportation advantages were no longer final. For independents, that possibility carried emotional weight. A pipeline meant oxygen. It meant maybe the gate could be moved. Maybe the industry did not have to pass through the same hands forever. Here is where many companies fail. They defend the old bottleneck until the market routes around them. Rockefeller did something more adaptive. Standard deepened its move into logistics infrastructure. Pipelines, terminals, storage, gathering systems, transportation coordination. If the railroad bottleneck could be bypassed, Standard would try to own or dominate the next bottleneck. That pattern is the spine of the episode. Start with refining. Use transport leverage. When transport is challenged, integrate deeper. When state law blocks control, invent a new control structure. When courts attack the structure, reorganize the control. And when the federal government finally attacks the whole system, discover that financial value can survive even after founder control is surrendered. Tidewater matters because it shows Rockefeller was not merely exploiting one trick. He was playing a moving game. Bottlenecks shift. The control system has to shift with them. If a founder builds advantage around one gate, and that gate disappears, the advantage can vanish. But if the founder understands why the gate mattered, they can look for the next gate before everyone else sees it. For Standard Oil, the gate moved from refining scale to railroad access to pipeline infrastructure to corporate coordination. Each move was rational. Each move also made the company harder to defend politically, because the more complete the control system became, the less it looked like market competition. It looked like private government. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil had a problem created by its own success. It operated across state lines. It controlled or influenced refineries, pipelines, purchasing, transportation, and sales networks in multiple jurisdictions. But American corporate law was not built for a single company to simply own and manage all of that across state borders in the modern way. The empire had outgrown the legal container, so on January 2, 1882, Standard Oil created the Standard Oil Trust. The trust allowed a small group of trustees to coordinate many separate corporate interests through a centralized structure. This was brilliant from a control perspective. It allowed national command. It gave Standard a way to coordinate pricing, investment, logistics, and ownership across a sprawling empire. By the early 1880s, Standard was commonly associated with control of roughly 90% of American oil refining, and it had major influence across pipelines and distribution. Inside the company, this could be justified as order. Oil demand was growing. Kerosene was lighting homes. Lubricants and other petroleum products were feeding a more industrial economy. Scale promised reliability, lower costs, and fewer destructive price wars. From Rockefeller's point of view, fragmentation was not freedom. It was waste in barrels, freight, duplicated refineries, speculative drilling, and unstable prices. Waste everywhere. But the same structure that solved the control problem also created a visible target. Before the trust, the empire could appear as a web of related companies, contracts, and local arrangements. After the trust, critics had a symbol, a name, a mechanism, a thing to attack. This is what happens when operational genius meets political visibility. Inside Standard, the trust made sense. Outside Standard, it confirmed the fear. The public did not see a cleaner kerosene supply chain. They saw a secretive machine coordinating an essential industry. The machine was efficient. The machine was also terrifying. And by the 1880s and 1890s, antitrust energy was rising. Farmers, independent producers, journalists, state officials, and rival businessmen were increasingly suspicious of concentrated corporate power. The Sherman Antitrust Act passed in 1890. Standard Oil became one of the great examples people reached for when they wanted to explain what monopoly power looked like. The political mood had shifted. In 1872, the anger was local and industrial. By 1890, the anger had become national and legal. Americans were trying to decide whether the new corporations were simply bigger businesses or a new kind of private power the old rules could not hold. Then came Ohio. On March 2, 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court declared the trust agreement void as to Standard Oil Company of Ohio, and the later dissolution and reorganization steps followed from there. That could have been a surrender point. A company built on control was being told its control structure was illegal. Put yourself inside that moment. You have spent 2 decades building a machine where every part reinforces every other part. Refining supports transport. Transport supports purchasing. Purchasing supports pricing. Pricing supports acquisition. Acquisition supports scale. Scale supports negotiation. Now a court says the structure must dissolve. If you obey literally, the machine weakens. If you resist openly, you invite more attack. If you comply on paper while preserving coordination in practice, you buy time. What do you choose? Standard chose the third path. The trust form was attacked, but the underlying control did not simply disappear. Standard reorganized. The empire survived through new arrangements, including later holding company structures. Financially, this bought time. Politically, it intensified distrust. That was the next turn. Compliance could preserve control, but it also compounded suspicion. Compliance theater can preserve control in the short term, but it compounds suspicion. From a narrow operator's view, Standard was solving a legal design problem. From a public view, Standard was proving that no court order could truly reach it. This is where the moat begins turning into evidence. Every workaround says the control is more important than the form. Every reorganization says we will change the wrapper, not the power. Every legal adaptation says the empire understands law as another logistics problem, and that is dangerous. Because law is not just another bottleneck. Law is where society decides which bottlenecks are allowed to exist. The years between 1892 and 1911 are not dead space. They are the years when suspicion hardens. Standard continued to operate as a vast coordinated system. Its managers could argue that the public benefited from stable supply and lower costs. Its opponents could argue that those benefits came from a market no longer free enough to discipline the company. Both sides were talking about efficiency, but they meant different things. Standard meant efficiency inside the system. Critics meant efficiency of the system itself, including the right of outsiders to compete without asking permission from the dominant firm. That difference is everything. Rockefeller himself had stepped back from day-to-day management by the late 1890s, though his ownership and legacy remained central. But the system he helped build continued. By the time the federal antitrust case reached its final stage, the question was larger than Rockefeller's personal management. Could an integrated monopoly defend itself as efficient? Could lower costs and better coordination justify the power used to build and maintain that coordination? Could a private company control so much of an essential industry that the public no longer believed in the market around it? In 1911, the Supreme Court answered, no, on May 15, 1911, in Standard Oil Co. of New Jersey v. United States. The court held that Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered the company broken into separate entities. Centralized control ended. The founder's system was cut apart, but the financial ending is not simple. Rockefeller did not become poor. He became even richer as the separate companies gained market value over time. The breakup produced companies that would become major forces in American oil for generations. So the final irony is sharp. The monopoly was politically destroyed. The wealth survived. That is why this story is not a morality play with an easy final scene. Rockefeller built an extraordinarily efficient industrial machine. He also built it through methods and structures that made Americans fear the machine more than they admired the efficiency. By the end, the market value could be separated from founder control. The assets remained valuable. The command center did not. Here's the principle in one sentence. Bottleneck control compounds faster than product excellence. But when that control depends on secrecy, coercive leverage, or regulatory arbitrage, the moat becomes political liability. The mechanism is simple. Product excellence improves what the customer touches. Bottleneck control changes what competitors are allowed to attempt. If you control the choke point, you do not need to win every visible contest. You shape the cost of entry, the speed of movement, the terms of access, and the consequences of resistance. That is why bottleneck control compounds. It multiplies across the whole system. Rockefeller applied it 3 times with unusual clarity. First, he started with refining because refining was more controllable than drilling. In a chaotic oil market, Standard could use capital, process discipline, and scale to produce consistent kerosene at lower cost. That was not a scandal. That was operational advantage. Second, he used transportation as leverage. Rail rates, shipping volume, and logistics access could decide whether a rival survived. The South Improvement Company scandal showed the danger of using that leverage in secretive and discriminatory ways, but it also revealed the strategic truth. Transportation was not back office. It was power. Third, when rail leverage was threatened by pipelines, Standard moved deeper into infrastructure and coordination. Tidewater showed that a bottleneck could be bypassed. Standard's response was to chase the next choke point, not mourn the old one. Then came the legal version. The 1882 trust solved a coordination problem. The 1892 reorganization preserved control after legal attack. The 1911 breakup proved that a control system can become so visible and so distrusted that the state forces unbundling even if the assets themselves remain strong. For founders, investors, and operators, the lesson is not be like Rockefeller. That is too lazy. The lesson is to separate efficiency from control and control from legitimacy. Those are different questions. A company can be efficient and illegitimate. A company can be powerful and fragile. A company can win financially while losing permission to keep winning the same way. So use 3 lenses. First, where is the real bottleneck? Not where the product is most impressive, not where the pitch deck points. The real bottleneck is the place where access, cost, speed, or coordination determines whether everyone else can compete. In software, the bottleneck may be distribution, not code. In a marketplace, liquidity matters more than the app. Media companies fight over attention before production quality. For a financial platform, the gate may be trust, regulation, data access, or the payment rails under the interface. Ask the uncomfortable version. If a competitor copied the product tomorrow, what gate would still keep them weak? Second, is the bottleneck earned or hidden? Earned control comes from better service, lower cost, superior reliability, or real infrastructure investment. Hidden control depends on secrecy, special treatment, intimidation, or exploiting rules others cannot see. This is where operators lie to themselves. They call it partnership strategy. They call it enterprise sales. They call it platform economics. Sometimes it is. But sometimes the real advantage is that suppliers are scared, competitors are boxed out, and customers do not understand the terms shaping their choices. That kind of control can print money until the story changes. Third, what happens when the bottleneck becomes public? If your advantage only works while customers, regulators, suppliers, or partners do not understand it, you are not just holding a moat, you are holding a future scandal. This is the part many builders do not want to hear. The market may reward a control strategy long before society judges it. Investors may celebrate the margin expansion. Competitors may quietly disappear. Customers may even benefit from lower prices for a while. Then one day, the same facts get renamed. The same integration that sounded like discipline becomes monopoly. The same negotiation that sounded like scale becomes coercion. The same legal creativity that sounded like clever structuring becomes evidence of evasion. The same founder who looked inevitable starts looking untouchable. And untouchable is a dangerous brand. Rockefeller's life force is an uncomfortable distinction. He was not merely a cartoon monopolist. He was disciplined, patient, numerate, religiously serious, and obsessed with waste. Standard Oil improved parts of the oil business. It made kerosene more reliable. It reduced costs. It built systems where there had been chaos. And still, the control system became too much. That is the proto lesson. Scale is not just about getting bigger. Scale is about deciding which constraint you want to own. Risk management is not just avoiding downside. It is understanding when the thing that protects you financially creates a larger institutional risk. So ask sharper transfer questions. If you are a founder, are you building a product customers love or a gate competitors cannot pass? If you are an investor, is the margin coming from genuine efficiency or from a hidden dependency that will look ugly in discovery, journalism, or regulation? If you are an operator, would your strategy still sound clean if the private contracts, rate cards, ranking rules, or partner terms became public tomorrow? If you are a customer, are you choosing freely or choosing inside a market someone else has quietly narrowed? And if you are a regulator or policymaker, are you attacking size itself or the specific control point that turns size into exclusion? Those questions are harder than asking whether a company is good or bad. They are also more useful. Rockefeller controlled the bottlenecks until the bottlenecks controlled the story. Refining gave him the platform. Railroads gave him leverage. Pipelines forced adaptation. The trust gave him national command. The court orders revealed the limits of paper compliance. The breakup proved that ownership can survive after control is taken away. That is rare, and it is the final paradox. Standard Oil became the example used to restrain monopoly power in America. Rockefeller became richer after the restraint, so when you look at a dominant company, do not only ask whether its product is good, ask what it controls that others must pass through. Ask whether that control lowers real costs or merely raises everyone else's cost of resistance. Ask whether the moat can survive daylight, because product excellence wins customers. Bottleneck control shapes markets, but legitimacy decides how long the market lets the bottleneck remain private. Next time, we stay with the same question in a different form. What happens when a founder does not control a physical choke point, but a psychological one? Not oil moving through pipes, attention moving through people. And the price of owning that gate may be just as high.